To have Professor Marjorie Cohn with us tonight. She's also president of the National Lawyers Guild and a professor at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, where she teaches criminal law, evidence, and international human rights law. She's a longtime criminal defense attorney and is the author of several books. Her most recent book, Cowboy Republic: 6 Ways the Bush Gang Has Defied the Law, is going to be the subject of her lecture tonight. And tonight, Marjorie will talk about the illegality of the invasion of Iraq, the illegality of the U.S. policy and practice of torture, detention and treatment of Guantanamo prisoners, and the illegality of the military commission trials procedure for detainees, including Canadian Omar Khadr. Equally important, though, for all of us here tonight, Marjorie will also talk about the critical necessity of citizens acting to put an end to war and an end to state violations of the law and the rule of law. As Marjorie has previously been quoted as saying, it is time for us to demand justice and accountability. Our lives and the lives of our children depend on it. Thank you for taking time to be here tonight. I ask you to welcome Marjorie Cohn.
Now, many of you probably know that at Nuremberg, after World War II, for the first time, individuals were held criminally liable for the most serious crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression, according to the Nuremberg Tribunal, was considered the supreme international crime because it contained within itself all of the other crimes. The United States is prosecuting a war of aggression against the people of Iraq. A war of aggression is a crime against peace as defined by the United Nations Charter. The UN Charter is part of U.S. law, notwithstanding George W. Bush's distaste for international law. Treaties that we ratify, when I say we, I mean the United States government, which I do not claim to be part of, but treaties that the United States ratifies become part of U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And the UN Charter specifies that no country shall use armed force against another country except in 2 instances. One in self-defense, and the other when the Security Council gives its blessing. Neither of those things was present before the United States invaded Iraq in so-called Operation Iraqi Freedom. Now it turns out that the Center for Public Integrity and the Fund for Independence in Journalism have documented 935 lies that the Bush administration made in the 2 years following the September 11th attacks. 935 lies about alleged weapons of mass destruction alleged weapons of mass destruction possessed by Saddam Hussein and alleged ties between Al Qaeda and Iraq. And what the study concluded was that the statements were part of an orchestrated campaign that effectively galvanized public opinion and, in the process, led the nation to war under decidedly false pretenses. If you would like to look at these statements, they're at publicintegrity.org. And the chief culprits were George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of State Colin Powell, Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, and White House Press Secretaries Ari Fleischer and Scott McClellan. So this is how, and I document this in my book as well, the Bush administration convinced the American people and indeed the Congress that Iraq presented a danger to us. the CIA was coming out with intelligence reports saying that Iraq was not a danger. Yet Dick Cheney went across the street to the CIA and continually pressured the CIA to come up with intelligence that would support a policy that had been decided upon long before September 11th. September 11th was the catalyst that allowed the Bush administration to put into effect this campaign to change Saddam Hussein, to oust Saddam Hussein and change the regime. Now, if Saddam Hussein had been amenable to corporate foreign investment in that country and given oil companies sweet deals and allowed us to put our bases there, he would still be the president of Iraq today. But he was resistant, and I'm not defending Saddam Hussein. He was not a great guy, but he did not pose a threat to the United States or any other country. He had not invaded any country in the last 12 years since Kuwait, and his military capacity had been effectively neutered by the Gulf War, by the decade of punishing sanctions under the Clinton regime, and the nearly daily bombings in the so-called no-fly zones. He was not a threat. The Bush administration knew he was not a threat, and yet they continued with their rhetoric about the mushroom cloud, the weapons of mass destruction, Al-Qaeda getting a hold of these weapons, and finally led us into war. So there was not an imminent threat that justified self-defense. The other exception, which I mentioned, to the prohibition on the use of force in the UN Charter is when the Security Council agrees. The Bush administration went to the Security Council and got a resolution, 1441, which set up a regime of weapons inspections and talked about breaches of the weapons inspections agreements, but reserved to the Security Council itself the enforcement power, so that if Iraq was out of compliance with Resolution 1441, it was up to the Security Council, not to the United States or any other country, to enforce those resolutions. Bush knew that 1441 did not authorize the use of force, and in fact, 3 of the permanent members of the Security Council, France, Russia, and China, issued a statement saying that 1441 excludes automaticity in not allowing any country to enforce this resolution if Iraq was out of compliance. So Bush went back to the Security Council to try to get another resolution. And the Security Council said no, wouldn't give him another resolution. So he said, well, we don't really need another resolution anyway. We have these old resolutions left over from the Gulf War, 687, 678. And they will allow us, they plus 1441, will allow us to go into Iraq and change the regime. But none of those resolutions, individually or collectively, justified or authorized Bush and the UK to go into Iraq and change its regime. One of those resolutions gave the United States the ability to use force only to oust Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Once that was accomplished, the license ended. The other resolution set up a weapons inspections regime. Once again, only the Security Council had the authority to enforce that resolution. So no self-defense and no authorization from the Security Council, which makes it a crime against peace, a war of aggression. Now, what were the real reasons to go into Iraq? Well, I think that a clue to the real reasons can be found, actually 3 different things can be pointed to show the real reason that the United States went in and changed the regime. First of all, the huge mega military bases that Bush is building there. They're like small self-contained cities. Camp Anaconda, which is the largest embassy in the world, which is opening in the fall, sits on 15 square miles of Iraqi soil. It has a pool, a gym, a theater, a beauty salon, a school, 6 apartment buildings. Actually, that's a Camp Anaconda. The embassy is a $6 million embassy in the green zone. So these are the bases that are built there. And then there's the so-called Iraqi Oil Law, which has been the benchmark to gauge Iraqi progress, according to Bush, according to the U.S. Congress, according to the Iraq Study Group, according to the New York Times. The Iraqi Oil Law, which was written largely by the Bush administration, would turn over control of 3/4 of Iraq's oil to foreign oil companies. Okay, and then most recently, Bush has been negotiating a permanent military presence, U.S. military presence in Iraq to effectively tie the hands of whoever the next president is. His outline for the permanent U.S.-Iraqi economic relationship is to encourage the flow of foreign investments to Iraq, unquote. 2 senior Iraqi officials told the Associated Press that Bush is negotiating preferential treatment for U.S. investments. And this is in the absence of this Iraqi oil law. The reason that the Iraqi oil law has not become law is because the parliament has not passed it, the Iraqi parliament, and that's because the Iraqi oil unions oppose it. But Bush is going around them and negotiating with his hand-picked people in the government in Iraq to try to make sure that there's this permanent military presence. Now, Congress, and you probably, if you have been following the events in the United States, which I know many of you have, Congress has neither the Republican-controlled or the Democratic-controlled Congress has been very good at standing up to Bush's pressure. Bush waves the flag of the 9/11 tragedy, the September 11th tragedy, and says, if you don't do what I say, if you don't give me the Patriot Act, the authorization for the Iraq War, the Military Commissions Act, the so-called Protect America Act, you're going to look soft on terror and the terrorists are going to get us. And Congress has capitulated. What has been the result of this operation so-called Iraqi freedom? Well, in addition to the more than 4,000 U.S. troops and troops from other countries that have died, and many mercenaries as well, and they don't give us figures on that. The organization called Just Foreign Policy has estimated that 1,118,846 Iraqis have been killed. Now, this does not include the tens of thousands, the innumerable number of people who have been wounded, many of them with brain injuries, loss of limbs, and the money that has gone into this war is just phenomenal. So much so that the United States is on the verge of a recession. The Australian-born journalist John Pilger wrote, "The scale of death caused by the British and U.S. governments may well have surpassed that of the Rwanda genocide, making it the biggest single act of mass murder in the late 20th century and the 21st century." Well, in order to facilitate this policy of regime change, which also violates another treaty that the United States has ratified, Canada has as well, and that's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which forbids forcible regime change. The United States government has engaged in torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment of prisoners in U.S. custody in Iraq, in Afghanistan, at Guantanamo Bay Base, and in the secret CIA black sites around the world. Torture is illegal under the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. It's always illegal, even in times of war. There are no exceptions. It also violates the Geneva Conventions. It constitutes a war crime under the U.S. War Crimes Act, and it also violates the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And yet, the United States has been engaged in torture and cruel treatment all over the world. Okay, well, let's talk about Omar Khadr, Canadian citizen, who is facing charges of conspiracy, murder, attempted murder, spying, and supporting terrorism. Omar Khadr was captured in Afghanistan and brought to Guantanamo when he was 15 years old. In both places, he was repeatedly tortured and subjected to inhumane treatment. At the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, Omar Khadr was denied pain medication for his serious head and eye shrapnel wounds. At Guantanamo, his hands and feet were shackled together. He was bolted to the floor and left there for hours at a time. After he urinated on himself and on the floor, U.S. military guards mopped the floor with his skinny little body. Khadr was beaten in the head, dogs lunged at him, and he was threatened with rape and removal of his body parts. Omar cried frequently. He has nightmares, sweats, and hyperventilates, and he's hypervigilant, hearing sounds that he can't identify. When Omar's lawyer saw him for the first time in 2004, he thought, he's just a little kid. Why was Omar treated this way? He comes from a family allegedly active in Al-Qaeda. His charges stem from an incident where the U.S. sent Afghans into a compound where Omar and others were located. The people inside the compound killed the Afghans and began firing at the U.S. soldiers. The Americans dropped 2 500-pound bombs on the compound, killing everyone inside except Omar. After Omar threw a hand grenade, which killed an American, the soldiers shot Omar, blinding and seriously wounding him. Omar begged them in English to finish him off, but they didn't. They took him to Bagram Air Base and later to Guantanamo. According to Donald Reckhoff, who is the co-chair of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers Military Law Committee, Omar is in an unusual situation because he has a viable self-defense claim. This is what the lawyer says. We attacked the compound that he and his family were living in and the fact that he was only 15 at the time. If Omar were a U.S. citizen, he would not be subject to a trial by court-martial because of his, he would not even be subject to a trial by court-martial because of his age. He would be tried in the civilian courts. When the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2005, in the case of Roper versus Simmons, that children who were under 18 at the time of their crimes could not be executed, and the U.S. is the only Western democracy that still retains the death penalty, which is also a penalty that is available and being charged against these 6 alleged al-Qaeda members at Guantanamo. The Supreme Court said that youths display a lack of maturity and an underdeveloped sense of responsibility that often results in impetuous and ill-considered actions and decisions. A juvenile is more vulnerable or susceptible to negative influences, and his character is not as well formed as that of an adult. From a moral standpoint, Supreme Court Justice Kennedy wrote for the majority, it would be misguided to equate the failings of a minor with those of an adult. For a greater possibility exists that a minor's character deficiencies will be reformed. The Bush administration's treatment of Omar Khadr, the Canadian citizen, flies in the face of this Supreme Court opinion. Now, the 6 men who are charged at Guantanamo are charged with the death penalty. And the timing of these trials, after all these years of being held in the CIA black sites, tortured, and then brought to Guantanamo, the timing is very fortuitous, I think, because it's another way for the Bush administration to keep foremost in the minds of the American public the so-called war on terror. And when I say that, I'm not trying to minimize what happened on September 11th or what's happening in the world, but declaring war on a tactic, because terrorism is a tactic, which then allows you to continue to hold people forever without any resort to any kind of independent decision maker is illegal. Every major international criminal tribunal since Nuremberg, which includes the International Criminal Court, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, are set up to try the most egregious crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Yet none of them allow for the death penalty. But here in these kangaroo courts, in these military commissions at Guantanamo, the Bush administration, with hand-picked judges, are going to try people and possibly execute them, even though the death penalty is not available in these other criminal tribunals or even in other Western democracies.